The Nevada desert stretched endlessly before Catherine McKenna as she guided her mule train through the scorching heat of August 1863. The wagon wheels carved deep ruts in the sandy earth, while dust devils danced across the barren landscape like spirits from another world. Catherine wiped sweat from her brow with a calloused hand, her green eyes scanning the horizon for the landmark that would guide her to the trading post at Carson Ridge. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. She had been traveling alone for 6 days now, carrying supplies to the remote silver mining camps scattered throughout the Ruby Mountains. Most women would never dare venture into such dangerous territory. But Catherine possessed the iron determination of someone who had learned survival through necessity rather than choice. Her auburn hair, braided and pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat, caught the afternoon sunlight as she urged her tired animals forward through the shifting sands. The silence was broken only by the creaking of leather harnesses and the soft plodding of hooves against packed earth. Catherine had grown accustomed to the solitude of these long journeys, finding peace in the vast emptiness that intimidated most travelers. She understood the desert's moods, its sudden storms and hidden dangers, having learned to read the signs that could mean the difference between life and death in this unforgiving landscape. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson, Catherine noticed something that made her pull sharply on the reins. In the distance, near a cluster of weathered Joshua trees, she could see what appeared to be a figure struggling against something dark and treacherous. The movement was frantic, desperate, unlike anything she had witnessed in her years of desert travel. Catherine's heart raced as she realized what she was witnessing. A man was trapped in quicksand, the treacherous bog that formed where underground springs met certain types of clay soil. She had heard stories of such places from old prospectors, deadly traps that could swallow a horse and rider whole if they weren't careful about their footing. The struggling figure appeared to be sinking steadily, his movements becoming weaker with each passing moment. Without hesitation, Catherine jumped down from her wagon seat and began unhitching one of her strongest mules. Every second counted now, and she moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had faced countless emergencies during her years as a frontier trader. The leather rope she always carried for securing cargo would have to serve as a lifeline, though she wondered if it would be strong enough to pull a full-grown man from the sucking embrace of the bog. As she approached the quicksand pit, Catherine could see that the trapped figure was a Native American man, his long black hair matted with sweat and sand, his copper skin gleaming in the dying sunlight. What struck her most were his eyes, dark and intelligent, burning with a fierce determination to survive despite his desperate circumstances. He wore traditional Shoshone clothing, beautifully decorated with intricate beadwork that spoke of high rank within his tribe. The man looked up as Catherine approached, his expression shifting from resigned acceptance of death to cautious hope. When their eyes met across the 20 feet of treacherous ground that separated them, Catherine saw something that transcended the cultural barriers that divided their peoples. Here was a human being in mortal danger, and nothing else mattered in that moment except the fundamental obligation to preserve life when it was within her power to do so. Catherine quickly assessed the situation with the analytical mind that had kept her alive during years of dangerous trading expeditions. The quicksand pit extended roughly 15 feet in diameter, with the trapped man positioned near its center. He had already sunk to his chest, and she could see that his struggles were only making his situation worse. The wet sand clung to him with relentless suction, and every movement he made seemed to pull him deeper into its hungry embrace. The ground around the pit appeared stable enough to support her weight if she remained near the edges, but getting close enough to throw a rope would require careful positioning. Catherine tested each step as she moved, feeling for the firmness that would indicate solid footing versus the slight give that might signal the presence of more quicksand. The last thing this situation needed was for both of them to become trapped. Working quickly, Catherine fashioned a lasso from her rope and began calculating the physics of what she was attempting. The man would need something to grab onto, but she also needed to ensure that her own position remained secure enough to provide the leverage necessary for extraction. The mule she had brought would serve as an anchor point, but timing would be crucial to prevent the rope from breaking under the sudden strain. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The trapped man watched her preparations with growing understanding, and when she called out instructions in English, he responded with gestures that indicated comprehension despite the language barrier. Catherine realized that he grasped both, the mechanics of what she was attempting and the risks involved for both of them. His calm acceptance of the danger she was taking on his behalf impressed her with its quiet dignity. Catherine's first throw fell short, the rope landing in the quicksand several feet from the man's outstretched hands. She quickly pulled it back, noting how the wet sand tried to claim the hemp fibers just as hungrily as it held its human victim. The second attempt came closer, but still not close enough for him to reach without shifting his position in ways that might accelerate his descent into the bog. On her third try, Catherine managed to place the loop within arm's reach of the struggling man. She watched with held breath as he carefully worked his arms free from the sand's grip, his movements slow and deliberate to avoid creating the suction that would pull him down faster. When his fingers finally closed around the rope, Catherine felt a surge of hope mixed with the sobering realization that the hardest part of the rescue was yet to come. The extraction process proved more difficult than Catherine had anticipated. The quicksand seemed reluctant to release its victim, holding onto him with a force that required every ounce of strength she could muster. She had positioned herself behind the mule, using the animal's bulk and her own body weight to create the leverage needed to pull steadily against the bog's suction. Inch by painful inch, the trapped man began to rise from his sandy prison. Catherine's muscles strained against the rope as she maintained constant pressure, never allowing the sand to regain its hold on her burden. The man in the quicksand worked with her, using his arms to help lift his torso, while she provided the upward force that his legs could not generate from their trapped position. Sweat poured down her face as she fought against both the desert, heat, and the physical demands of the rescue. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the man's waist cleared the surface of the quicksand. Catherine could see the relief in his eyes as he realized that escape was now possible, though still not certain. The bog continued to grip his legs with tenacious strength, requiring continued effort from both rescuer and victim to complete the extraction. When the man's knees finally broke free from the quicksand's embrace, Catherine felt a surge of triumph that was immediately tempered by concern for his condition. He appeared exhausted from his ordeal, and she could see that his legs were covered with abrasions where the sand had scoured his skin during the struggle. More concerning was his obvious dehydration, evidenced by the way his hands shook as he tried to clean sand from his face. Catherine helped him move to solid ground well away from the dangerous bog, then retrieved her water jug from the wagon. She offered it to him without hesitation, watching as he drank deeply before nodding his gratitude with the formal dignity she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of his bearing. Even in his weakened state, exhausted and covered with sand, he maintained a presence that spoke of natural authority and command. As the immediate crisis passed, Catherine found herself studying the man she had rescued with growing curiosity. His clothing, while practical for desert travel, was made from materials and decorated with craftsmanship that indicated high status within his community. The beadwork on his shirt featured patterns she didn't recognize, but their complexity and beauty suggested they held significant meaning. Most intriguingly, he wore a necklace of turquoise and silver that seemed far too valuable for ordinary wear. The man noticed her examination and seemed to reach some internal decision. When he spoke, his English was careful but clear, carrying only a slight accent that suggested extensive contact with white traders. He introduced himself as Running Wolf, chief of the eastern Shoshone band that controlled the territories surrounding the Ruby Mountains. The revelation that she had rescued a tribal leader added new dimensions to an already remarkable situation. Running Wolf explained that he had been returning from a solitary vision quest in the high mountains when his horse had bolted during a rattlesnake encounter. His pursuit of the animal had led him across unfamiliar terrain where he had unknowingly stepped into the quicksand trap. Without Catherine's intervention, he would certainly have died, alone and far from his people, with no one to know his fate or carry word to his tribe. As they talked, Catherine learned that Running Wolf was not merely a war chief, but a leader known throughout the region for his wisdom in both combat and diplomacy. He had spent years working to maintain peaceful relations with white settlers, while protecting his people's traditional lands and way of life. His death would have created a power vacuum that could have destabilized the entire region's delicate balance between competing interests. The conversation revealed that both Catherine and Running Wolf shared similar perspectives on the challenges facing their respective communities. She had seen firsthand how cultural misunderstandings and mutual suspicion created conflicts that served no one's interests, while he had struggled to find middle ground between those in his tribe who wanted complete isolation and those who advocated for total assimilation into white society. As evening approached and the desert air began to cool, Catherine realized that she faced a decision with implications extending far beyond simple humanitarian obligation. Running Wolf was clearly in no condition to travel alone, still weakened from his ordeal and without transportation to carry him back to his people. She could provide assistance, but doing so would mean deviating from her planned route and potentially missing important business commitments at the trading posts. More significantly, traveling with a Shoshone chief during a period of heightened tensions between Native American tribes and white settlers carried substantial risks. If they encountered military patrols or hostile civilians, her motives might be questioned and her actions misinterpreted. The consequences could range from loss of her trading license to accusations of collaboration with hostile forces, either of which could destroy the livelihood she had worked years to establish. But Catherine had not survived 7 years as an independent trader in dangerous territory by making decisions based on fear rather than principle. She had built her reputation on reliability and fair dealing with all customers, regardless of their background, and that reputation was worth more than any temporary inconvenience or political complications her choice might create. Running Wolf seemed to understand the complexity of her situation without needing detailed explanation. He offered to make his own way back to his people, but Catherine could see that such an attempt would be both dangerous and likely unsuccessful given his weakened condition and lack of supplies. The nearest Shoshone settlement was at least 3 days' travel through difficult terrain, far too risky for someone in his current state. Catherine made her decision with the same straightforward practicality that had guided her through countless other challenges. She would escort Running Wolf back to his people, accepting whatever delays or complications might result. The choice felt less like heroism than simple common sense, the natural response of one human being to another's need for assistance when such assistance was within her power to provide. The practical arrangements for their journey required careful consideration of both safety and cultural sensitivity. Catherine's wagon contained trade goods that would be valuable to the Shoshone, but she needed to ensure that her cargo remained secure while providing appropriate transportation for her unexpected passenger. Running Wolf insisted on helping with the work despite his fatigue, demonstrating the kind of personal dignity that refused to accept charity without contributing what he could in return. As they prepared camp for the night, Catherine found herself reassessing many assumptions she had held about Native American culture and society. Running Wolf's knowledge of desert survival, his understanding of animal behavior, and his insights into weather patterns far exceeded her own considerable expertise. He shared information about water sources and safe camping spots that could prove invaluable during future trading expeditions. The evening conversation revealed depths of wisdom and experience that challenged Catherine's preconceptions about the differences between civilized and savage societies. Running Wolf spoke eloquently about complex philosophical concepts, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of political strategy, and showed appreciation for artistic beauty that rivaled anything she had encountered in formal educational settings. Most surprisingly, Running Wolf possessed extensive knowledge about mining techniques and mineral identification, skills he had acquired through generations of Shoshone experience with precious metals in their traditional territories. He explained that his people had been working silver deposits in the Ruby Mountains for centuries, using methods passed down through countless generations of skilled craftsmen. Catherine realized that she was receiving insights into mineral wealth that could revolutionize her understanding of the region's commercial potential. Running Wolf's casual references to silver veins and hidden deposits suggested resources far beyond anything currently known to white prospectors and mining companies. The knowledge represented a form of payment for his rescue that could prove more valuable than any conventional reward. But even as Catherine recognized the potential significance of what she was learning, she remained focused on the immediate challenge of ensuring Running Wolf's safe return to his people. Trust was developing between them, but she understood that such trust was fragile and could be shattered by any appearance of exploitation or self-interest on her part. The desert night brought its own challenges, as temperatures dropped dramatically from the day's scorching heat. Catherine shared her blankets and built a fire large enough to provide warmth for both travelers, while Running Wolf contributed knowledge about which desert plants could be used for medicinal purposes and which ones provided the best fuel for long-burning flames. Their collaboration during these practical tasks continued building the foundation of mutual respect that would prove crucial in the days ahead. Catherine discovered that Running Wolf possessed leadership qualities that transcended cultural boundaries, the ability to inspire confidence and cooperation that mark truly effective leaders regardless of their background or training. As stars emerged in the clear desert sky, Catherine reflected on the strange turns that had brought her to this moment. A routine trading expedition had become something far more significant, an encounter that was challenging her understanding of herself and her place in the complex social dynamics of frontier life. She sensed that rescuing Running Wolf from the quicksand had set in motion events whose full implications she could not yet imagine. The chief seemed to share her sense that their meeting represented more than simple coincidence. He spoke of visions and spiritual signs that had guided him toward this particular location at this specific time, concepts that Catherine's practical mind struggled to fully comprehend but could not entirely dismiss. There was something about the man's quiet certainty that suggested deeper truths lay beneath surface appearances. Running Wolf's references to sacred obligations and spiritual debts introduced Catherine to aspects of Shoshone culture that she had never encountered in her previous dealings with Native American traders. The concept that her rescue had created bonds of honor that could not be repaid through conventional means opened entirely new perspectives on intercultural relationships and mutual obligations. as the fire burned lower and conversation gave way to the desert's nighttime symphony of distant coyote calls and rustling vegetation. Catherine found herself looking forward to the journey ahead with anticipation rather than apprehension. Whatever challenges they might face, she sensed that traveling with Running Wolf would prove educational in ways that could reshape her entire approach to frontier life and cross-cultural understanding. The last thing she remembered before sleep, it claimed her, was Running Wolf's quiet voice, speaking in Shoshone, words that sounded like prayers or promises carried on the desert wind toward the star-filled sky above. Dawn broke over the Nevada desert with the gradual transformation of purple shadows into golden light, casting long fingers of illumination across the sandy expanse where Catherine and Running Wolf had made their camp. The morning air carried a crisp coolness that would soon give way to another day of punishing heat, but for now provided welcome relief from the previous day's scorching temperatures. Catherine stirred first, her trader's instincts automatically assessing weather conditions and planning the day's travel before she was fully awake. Running Wolf was already sitting upright beside the dying embers of their fire, his dark eyes scanning the horizon with the vigilant attention of someone accustomed to reading potential dangers in the landscape. Despite his ordeal in the quicksand and obvious fatigue, he maintained the alert bearing of a leader responsible for the safety of others. Catherine noticed that his color had improved overnight, though she could see he still favored his left leg where the sand had abraded the skin during his extraction. As they shared a simple breakfast of hardtack and dried meat from Catherine's supplies, Running Wolf provided detailed information about the route they would need to follow to reach his people's current location. The eastern Shoshone were camped in the high meadows near Eagle Creek, approximately 50 miles northeast through terrain that would test both Catherine's knowledge of desert travel and her wagon's ability to navigate rocky passes and narrow canyon trails. The journey would require careful planning to ensure adequate water supplies and safe camping locations. Running Wolf's intimate knowledge of the landscape proved invaluable as he described hidden springs and sheltered valleys that didn't appear on any map Catherine had seen. His ability to read subtle signs in rock formations and vegetation patterns revealed generations of accumulated wisdom about surviving in this harsh environment. Catherine realized that her rescue of Running Wolf had inadvertently provided her with access to geographical intelligence that could revolutionize her trading operations throughout the region. The water sources and safe passages he described would allow her to establish new routes that could reduce travel time and increase the efficiency of her supply runs to remote mining camps. The practical value of this information began to approach the significance of any conventional reward. As they loaded Catherine's wagon and prepared to depart, Running Wolf insisted on walking rather than riding despite his injuries. He explained that his presence as a passenger might create confusion among any travelers they encountered, while his obvious ability to keep pace with the wagon would demonstrate that he was traveling as an equal partner rather than a captive or burden. The distinction mattered greatly in the complex social dynamics that governed frontier interactions between whites and Native Americans. Their first day of travel together established patterns of cooperation that transcended the cultural barriers Catherine had expected to encounter. Running Wolf's expertise in reading animal tracks and weather signs complemented her mechanical knowledge of wagon maintenance and route planning. They worked together with an efficiency that suggested years of partnership rather than a relationship that had begun less than 24 hours earlier. The conversation during their journey revealed the depth of Running Wolf's education and experience in dealing with white society. He had attended a missionary school in his youth, learning to read and write English while maintaining his connection to traditional Shoshone culture and customs. This dual perspective gave him unique insights into the misunderstandings and conflicts that arose when two vastly different societies attempted to coexist in the same territory. Running Wolf shared stories of successful cooperation between Shoshone bands and white settlers, partnerships that had benefited both communities through trade agreements and mutual defense pacts. He also described the failures and betrayals that had undermined trust, creating cycles of retaliation that served no one's interests. His balanced perspective impressed Catherine with its lack of bitterness, despite obvious injustices his people had suffered. The chief's knowledge of regional politics extended far beyond simple tribal concerns. He understood the economic forces driving westward expansion, the role of mineral wealth in attracting settlers to traditionally Shoshone lands, and the federal policies that were reshaping territorial governance. His sophisticated grasp of these complex issues challenged Catherine's assumptions about Native American leaders and their capacity for strategic thinking. As their wagon climbed steadily toward the foothills of the Ruby Mountains, the landscape began to change from flat desert to rolling hills covered with sagebrush and scattered pine trees. The elevation gain brought cooler temperatures and occasional breezes that provided relief from the oppressive heat of the lower elevations. Catherine noticed that Running Wolf seemed to gain strength as they moved into terrain that was more familiar to him. Their route took them past several abandoned mining claims, where optimistic prospectors had tried and failed to extract profitable quantities of silver from stubborn ore deposits. Running Wolf examined these sites with professional interest, pointing out technical errors in excavation techniques and explaining how traditional Shoshone methods might have yielded better results. His casual expertise in metallurgy surprised Catherine, who had never considered that Native American cultures might possess sophisticated knowledge of mineral extraction. The conversation turned to the broader implications of mineral wealth in shaping relationships between white settlers and Native American tribes. Running Wolf observed that most conflicts arose from misunderstandings about land ownership and resource rights, rather than fundamental incompatibilities between the peoples themselves. He suggested that many disputes could be resolved through agreements that recognized both traditional tribal claims and legitimate settler interests. Catherine found herself increasingly impressed by Running Wolf's vision of coexistence based on mutual benefit rather than zero-sum competition. His proposals for shared mining ventures and joint trading partnerships demonstrated creative thinking that transcended conventional approaches to intercultural relations. She began to see possibilities for business arrangements that could prove profitable while respecting traditional Shoshone rights and customs. Their second night of travel brought them to a natural campsite beside a clear mountain stream where Running Wolf's people had traditionally stopped during seasonal migrations. Between winter and summer territories, the location provided fresh water, good grazing for Catherine's mules, and defensive positions that would allow them to spot potential threats from several directions. The chief's selection of this site demonstrated the strategic thinking that had made him an effective leader in both peace and war. As they established camp, Running Wolf began sharing more detailed information about the silver deposits his people had worked for generations in the higher elevations of the Ruby Mountains. He described veins of ore so rich that traditional hand tools could extract significant quantities of pure metal, deposits that had remained secret because the Shoshone understood that revealing their location would bring floods of prospectors and miners who would destroy the natural balance of the region. The trust implicit in Running Wolf's willingness to share such sensitive information struck Catherine with profound force. He was offering her access to mineral wealth that could make her incredibly rich, but the gift came with obvious expectations about how such knowledge would be used. She understood that accepting his information would create obligations and responsibilities that extended far beyond simple business considerations. Catherine began to grasp the magnitude of the choice she faced. Running Wolf's silver deposits could represent the opportunity she had been seeking throughout her years as a frontier trader, the chance to establish permanent financial security and social standing in a society that offered few such opportunities to independent women. But accepting his gift would also make her a partner in maintaining the delicate balance between Shoshone interests and white expansion into their traditional territories. The moral complexity of the situation reminded Catherine of the choice she had faced when first encountering Running Wolf trapped in the quicksand. She could pursue the safer course of maintaining distance and avoiding complications, or she could accept the risks and responsibilities that came with deeper involvement in intercultural cooperation. The potential rewards were enormous, but so were the potential consequences of failure. Running Wolf seemed to understand her internal struggle without requiring detailed explanation. He spoke about the spiritual beliefs that governed Shoshone attitudes toward mineral wealth, concepts that viewed silver and gold as sacred gifts from the earth that carried obligations to use them wisely and responsibly. His people had always extracted only what they needed, leaving the majority of the deposits undisturbed for future generations. The conversation revealed fundamental differences in how white and Native American societies conceptualized ownership and resource management. Where white culture emphasized individual accumulation and maximum extraction of value, Shoshone tradition focused on sustainable use and collective benefit. Running Wolf suggested that successful cooperation would require finding middle ground. Between these competing philosophies, Catherine realized that her partnership with Running Wolf could serve as a model for the kind of intercultural cooperation that might prevent the conflicts and betrayals that had characterized so many previous attempts at peaceful coexistence. If they could demonstrate that white and Native American interests could be aligned through carefully structured agreements, their success might influence broader policy discussions about territorial development and tribal relations. The practical details of implementing such cooperation presented significant challenges. Catherine would need to navigate complex legal frameworks governing mineral rights, tribal sovereignty, and territorial jurisdiction. Running Wolf would face resistance from traditionalists within his own community who opposed any form of partnership. With white society, both would need to maintain the trust of their respective communities while working together toward mutually beneficial goals. Their third day of travel brought them into the heart of Shoshone territory, where Catherine began to notice subtle signs of the tribe's presence in the landscape. Running Wolf pointed out trail markers and boundary indicators that were invisible to untrained eyes, but conveyed important information to those who understood their meaning. The chief was essentially providing her with a course in reading the cultural geography of Native American land use. The education Catherine received during their journey together exceeded anything she could have learned through years of conventional contact with tribal traders. Running Wolf's willingness to share detailed knowledge about Shoshone customs, social organization, and decision-making processes gave her insights that could prove invaluable in future negotiations and business relationships. She began to understand how her rescue of a single individual had opened doors to understanding an entire culture. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew thinner and cooler, requiring adjustments to their travel pace and camping arrangements. Catherine's wagon performed well on the improved trails that Running Wolf's people had maintained for generations, though she needed to use all her mechanical skills to navigate particularly challenging sections of rocky terrain. The chief's guidance proved essential in selecting routes that were within her equipment's capabilities. Their approach to the Shoshone encampment required careful consideration of protocol and cultural sensitivity. Running Wolf explained that his unexpected return in the company of a white woman would create curiosity and potential concern among his people. Catherine's presence would need to be properly introduced and her intentions clearly explained to prevent misunderstandings that could escalate into serious problems for both of them. The chief outlined the formal procedures that would govern Catherine's introduction to the tribal council and the steps necessary to establish her credentials as a trustworthy partner in potential business arrangements. His detailed explanation of Shoshone social customs and political structures provided Catherine with knowledge that few white traders had ever acquired. She understood that this information represented another form of payment for her rescue, perhaps more valuable than any material reward. Running Wolf's discussion of internal tribal politics revealed the challenges he faced as a leader, trying to balance competing factions within his community. Progressive members of the tribe advocated for increased cooperation with white society as a means of accessing new technologies and economic opportunities. Traditional conservatives worried that such cooperation would lead to the destruction of Shoshone culture and the loss of their ancestral lands. Catherine began to appreciate the complexity of Running Wolf's position as a leader responsible for navigating between these competing pressures while maintaining tribal unity and protecting his people's long-term interests. His willingness to risk his political standing by bringing her into the community demonstrated the depth of his commitment to the cooperation they had discussed during their journey together. The conversation turned to practical matters of how Catherine might establish ongoing trading relationships with the Shoshone that would benefit both communities. Running Wolf described the types of manufactured goods his people most needed and the traditional items they could offer in exchange. The potential for regular commerce appeared substantial, though it would require careful management to prevent the kind of exploitation that had characterized many previous white Indian trading relationships. As they prepared for their final approach to the Shoshone encampment, Catherine reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since encountering Running Wolf trapped in the quicksand. What had begun as a simple act of human decency had evolved into an opportunity for the kind of intercultural partnership that could reshape her entire future. The rescue had opened possibilities she could never have imagined when she first threw her rope toward a desperate man struggling against the desert's deadly embrace. Running Wolf's final words before they reached his people carried the weight of both promise and warning. He assured Catherine that her rescue of him had earned her a permanent place of honor among the Shoshone, but he also cautioned that such honor came with responsibilities that extended far beyond conventional business relationships. She was about to enter a world where actions had consequences that could ripple through generations, where the choices she made would be judged not only by their immediate results, but by their long-term impact on the welfare of both communities. The smoke from Shoshone cooking fires became visible in the distance as Catherine's wagon crested the final ridge before Eagle Creek. The moment of truth was approaching, when theory would give way to reality and the partnership she and Running Wolf had discussed would face its first real test. Catherine felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension as she prepared to discover whether her rescue of a dying chief would indeed lead to the Silver Mountains he had promised, or whether the complexities of intercultural cooperation would prove too challenging to overcome. The Shoshone encampment spread across the Eagle Creek Valley like a carefully orchestrated symphony of human habitation, with dozens of traditional teepees arranged in precise patterns that reflected the complex social hierarchy of the tribe. Catherine's wagon wheels crunched over pine needles and dried grass as Running Wolf guided her down the winding trail toward the heart of his people's temporary settlement. The smoke from countless cooking fires created a hazy canopy above the camp, while the sound of children's laughter and the steady rhythm of women grinding corn provided a domestic backdrop that seemed almost surreal after days of desert silence. Catherine felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon her as curious Shoshone emerged from their lodges to witness the unprecedented sight of their missing chief returning in the company of a white woman. The expressions she observed ranged from cautious curiosity to outright suspicion, with a few faces showing the kind of hardened hostility that spoke of painful experiences with white settlers. She maintained her composure despite the intensity of their scrutiny, understanding that her every gesture and expression would be analyzed and discussed long after her departure. Running Wolf raised his hand in a traditional greeting as they approached the central area of the camp, where a large fire pit surrounded by logs served as the community's gathering place for important discussions and ceremonies. Several elderly men emerged from a particularly elaborate tipi, decorated with intricate painted designs that Catherine recognized as symbols of spiritual and political authority. These would be the tribal elders, whose approval she would need to secure if any meaningful cooperation was to develop between her and the Shoshone people. The reunion between Running Wolf and his people unfolded with a dignity and restraint that impressed Catherine with its emotional depth, despite the absence of dramatic displays. Warriors who had obviously been searching for their missing chief embraced him with quiet relief, while women who were clearly relatives examined him for signs of injury or illness. The subdued celebration reflected the Shoshone understanding that a leader's safe return was cause for gratitude rather than boisterous festivities that might attract unwanted attention from potential enemies. The eldest of the tribal council members stepped forward to greet Running Wolf with formal words spoken in rapid Shoshone that Catherine could not understand, but whose tone conveyed both relief and gentle reproach. She watched the interplay between chief and elder with fascination, recognizing the kind of respectful disagreement that characterized healthy political relationships, even when she could not follow the specific content of their discussion. Running Wolf's responses seemed to acknowledge legitimate concerns, while maintaining his authority as a leader capable of making difficult decisions. When Running Wolf gestured toward Catherine and began explaining her presence in carefully measured English, she felt the focus of tribal attention shift to her with an intensity that was almost physical in its impact. The chief's introduction emphasized her role as his rescuer, while carefully avoiding details that might compromise her safety or his own political position. He described her as a trader, known for fair dealing with all peoples, someone whose actions had demonstrated the kind of courage and humanity that the Shoshone honored above material wealth. The response from the tribal council was measured and diplomatic, but Catherine could sense undercurrents of debate and disagreement that would likely continue long after she departed. Several of the younger warriors seemed intrigued by her presence and the possibilities it might represent, while older members of the community maintained expressions of careful neutrality that revealed nothing about their true feelings. The women's reactions appeared more uniformly positive, perhaps recognizing in Catherine's independence and self-reliance qualities they respected, regardless of cultural differences. Gray Eagle, the eldest council member whose weathered face spoke of 8 decades of mountain winters and desert summers, stepped forward to address Catherine directly in English that was formal but surprisingly fluent. His words carried the weight of traditional courtesy while making clear that her presence in their camp was both unprecedented and potentially problematic. He acknowledged her service to Running Wolf while emphasizing that such kindness created obligations and expectations that extended far beyond simple gratitude. Catherine responded with the respectful directness that had served her well in business negotiations, acknowledging the honor of being welcomed into the Shoshone camp, while making clear that she sought nothing beyond the opportunity to demonstrate that cooperation between their peoples could benefit both communities. Her straightforward approach seemed to resonate with Grey Eagle's own preference for honest communication over diplomatic circumlocution, establishing a foundation for the more detailed discussions that would follow. The formal introductions completed, Running Wolf invited Catherine to join the evening meal, where she would have opportunities for informal conversation with various members of the community. The invitation represented both an honor and a test, as her behavior during the shared meal would be observed and evaluated by people whose approval could determine whether any meaningful relationship developed between her and the tribe. Catherine understood that she was being given a chance to demonstrate her worthiness as a potential partner in the ventures Running Wolf had described during their journey. As the sun set behind the western peaks, casting long shadows across the valley floor, Catherine found herself seated beside a cooking fire with a diverse group of Shoshone men and women whose ages ranged from teenage to elderly. The conversation began tentatively, with careful questions about her background and experience as a trader, but gradually evolved into more substantial discussions about the challenges and opportunities facing both their communities in an era of rapid change and territorial expansion. The breadth of knowledge represented around the fire impressed Catherine with its scope and sophistication. These were not the primitive savages depicted in Eastern newspapers, but thoughtful individuals whose understanding of regional politics, economics, and social dynamics matched or exceeded that of most white settlers she had encountered. Their questions about white society revealed insights that challenged many of her own assumptions about cultural differences and the sources of intercultural conflict. Bright Star, a woman roughly Catherine's age, whose husband had been killed in a skirmish with cavalry troops 2 years earlier, spoke with particular eloquence about the challenges facing Shoshone families caught between traditional ways of life and the pressures of an encroaching white society. Her perspective on the practical difficulties of maintaining tribal customs while adapting to new realities provided Catherine with insights into the human costs of territorial expansion that rarely appeared in official reports or newspaper accounts. The conversation revealed that the Shoshone community was far from unified in its approach to dealing with white expansion into their traditional territories. Younger members of the tribe, particularly those who had received some formal education at mission schools, tended to favor increased cooperation and cultural adaptation as strategies for survival in a rapidly changing world. Older tribal members worried that such accommodations would lead to the gradual destruction of everything that made Shoshone culture distinctive and valuable. Swift Horse, a war chief whose scarred hands testified to his experience in defending tribal territories, expressed the concerns of those who favored resistance over accommodation. He argued that every compromise with white society led to greater demands and additional losses of tribal autonomy. His perspective, while more militant than Running Wolf's, was presented with reasoned arguments that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of historical patterns in white Indian relations throughout the frontier regions. Catherine found herself engaged in the kind of substantive political discussion she rarely encountered, even among educated whites in established communities. The Shoshone participants demonstrated knowledge of federal policies, territorial governance, and economic trends that rivaled anything she had heard in legislative sessions or business meetings. Their ability to analyze complex cause and effect relationships in social and political developments challenged every stereotype about Native American intellectual capabilities. The discussion turned to specific examples of successful cooperation between Indian tribes and white communities, ventures that had proven beneficial to both parties, while avoiding the exploitation and betrayal that characterized so many other attempts at peaceful coexistence. Running Wolf contributed examples from his own experience, while others shared stories passed down from relatives and allies in different regions. The accumulated evidence suggested that successful partnerships required careful attention to mutual benefit and scrupulous honoring of agreements by both parties. As the evening progressed, Catherine began to understand the complexity of the political situation within the Shoshone community and the challenges Running Wolf faced as a leader trying to navigate between competing factions while protecting his people's long-term interests. His support for cooperation with selected white partners was viewed with suspicion by some tribal members who had witnessed too many broken promises and betrayed trusts to believe that lasting peace was possible. With any representatives of white society, the conversation eventually turned to the practical question of what kinds of cooperation might prove beneficial without compromising essential tribal values and autonomy. Several participants expressed interest in trading relationships that would provide access to manufactured goods and new technologies, while allowing the Shoshone to maintain control over their traditional territories and resources. The challenge lay in structuring such arrangements to prevent the kind of dependency that had undermined other tribes' ability to maintain their independence. Catherine's contributions to the discussion focused on her experience with honest trading, practices and the business models that had allowed her to build lasting relationships with diverse communities throughout the territory. She described partnerships that respected cultural differences while creating mutual economic benefits, examples that seemed to resonate with Shoshone participants who were seeking alternatives to the exploitation they had observed in other white Indian business relationships. The emergence of trust during their conversation surprised Catherine with its rapidity and depth. These were people who had every reason to approach white visitors with suspicion and hostility, yet they were engaging her with the kind of open dialogue that suggested genuine interest in finding common ground. She began to understand that her rescue of Running Wolf had created opportunities for communication that would normally require years to develop through conventional diplomatic channels. Singing Hawk, an elderly woman whose role as a tribal historian gave her special authority in matters of tradition and custom, posed questions about Catherine's motivations that went to the heart of Shoshone concerns about white intentions. Why had she chosen to risk her own safety to rescue a man whose people were often characterized as enemies? What did she hope to gain from developing relationships with a community that most whites viewed as obstacles to progress and development? Catherine's answers seemed to satisfy Singing Hawk's concerns about hidden agendas or ulterior motives. Her explanation that she had acted from simple human decency rather than calculated self-interest aligned with Shoshone values that emphasized moral obligation over material advantage. The old woman's nod of approval carried weight that Catherine could feel rippling through the other participants in their evening conversation. The discussion took an unexpected turn when Grey Eagle began describing the sacred sites and traditional territories that held special significance for the Shoshone people. His willingness to share such sensitive information indicated a level of trust that Catherine recognized as both an honor and a responsibility. The elder was essentially providing her with knowledge that could prove invaluable in understanding the cultural geography of the region and the non-negotiable aspects of any partnership between her and the tribe. As the fire burned lower and the mountain air grew cold, Running Wolf began sharing more specific details about the silver deposits he had mentioned during their journey together. His description of hidden veins and secret mining sites created a stir of interest among the assembled Shoshone, some of whom had clearly not been aware of the full extent of their tribal wealth. Catherine realized that she was witnessing an internal debate about resource management that would have profound implications for the tribe's future. The revelation that their traditional territories contained silver deposits of extraordinary richness sparked intense discussion about how such wealth might be developed without destroying the natural environment or attracting the kind of mining boom that had devastated other Native American communities. Several participants voiced concerns that any extraction activities would inevitably bring floods of prospectors and miners whose presence would make it impossible to maintain traditional ways of life in the affected areas. Running Wolf's proposal for controlled development under joint Shoshone-white management represented a compromise between those who wanted complete preservation of traditional practices and those who recognized that some form of accommodation with white economic interests might be necessary for tribal survival. His suggestion that Catherine could serve as a trusted partner in such ventures sparked debate about whether any white person could be relied upon to honor agreements that conflicted with broader white interests in territorial development. The discussion revealed sophisticated understanding of the economic and political forces that were reshaping the American West. Knowledge that challenged Catherine's assumptions about Native American awareness of broader national trends. These Shoshone leaders understood that their traditional territories were becoming increasingly valuable to white settlers and that federal policies were systematically undermining tribal sovereignty. Their debate about response strategies demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that characterized effective political leadership regardless of cultural context. Bright Star's contribution to the conversation introduced gender perspectives that added another layer of complexity to the community's deliberations. She pointed out that traditional Shoshone society had always included women in important economic decisions, particularly those involving resource management and long-term community welfare. Her suggestion that Catherine's presence as a female partner might offer advantages in maintaining cultural balance reflected sophisticated understanding of how gender dynamics could influence intercultural cooperation. The evening's conversation concluded with Grey Eagle's formal invitation for Catherine to remain with the tribe for several days, while the council deliberated on Running Wolf's proposals for cooperation. The invitation represented both an honor and a test, as her behavior during an extended stay would provide tribal leaders with additional opportunities to evaluate her character and intentions. Catherine accepted the invitation with gratitude while recognizing that her every action during the coming days would influence decisions that could reshape her entire future. As the gathering dispersed and tribal members returned to their lodges, Catherine found herself assigned to a comfortable tepee near the center of the camp, where she could observe the daily life of the community while remaining under discreet supervision. The accommodation provided privacy while ensuring that her presence did not create disruptions or misunderstandings that could complicate the delicate negotiations that lay ahead. The night sounds of the Shoshone camp created a symphony of human and natural elements that spoke of centuries of adaptation to mountain environments. Children's sleepy voices mixed with the soft conversations of adults, while nightbirds and distant coyotes provided a wild counterpoint to the domestic sounds of community life. Catherine fell asleep to these sounds while contemplating the extraordinary turn her life had taken since encountering Running Wolf trapped in the desert quicksand. Her dreams that night were filled with images of silver veins threading through mountain rock and visions of trading caravans carrying goods between Shoshone camps and white settlements. The possibilities Running Wolf had described seemed both tantalizingly real and impossibly ambitious, representing opportunities that could make her wealthy beyond imagination while requiring her to navigate political and cultural complexities that could destroy everything she had worked to build. Morning brought new challenges as Catherine woke to discover that her presence in the camp had attracted attention from beyond the immediate Shoshone community. Running Wolf appeared at her tipi entrance with news that scouts had reported the approach of a cavalry patrol led by Captain Marcus Reynolds, an officer whose aggressive attitude toward Native Americans had earned him a reputation for creating conflicts rather than resolving them. The military presence would complicate everything Catherine and Running Wolf were trying to accomplish. The captain's arrival represented the kind of external pressure that could shatter the fragile trust being built between Catherine and the Shoshone community. Reynolds was known for his belief that any white person found among Indians was either a captive to be rescued or a traitor to be arrested. His presence would force both Catherine and the Shoshone to make decisions about their developing partnership under circumstances that favored confrontation over cooperation. Running Wolf's expression as he delivered this news revealed the depth of his concern about the military intervention. The timing of Reynolds' patrol seemed almost deliberately calculated to disrupt the negotiations that were beginning to show promise of producing beneficial results for both communities. Catherine realized that her test was about to become far more complex than simple cultural adaptation, as she would now need to defend her choices to representatives of her own society who were likely to view her presence among the Shoshone with deep suspicion. The sound of approaching horses could already be heard echoing across the valley as Captain Reynolds and his troops rode toward the Shoshone encampment with the aggressive confidence of men who believed they held military and moral superiority over everyone they encountered. Catherine understood that the next few hours would determine whether the partnership she and Running Wolf had envisioned could survive the intervention of authorities who viewed such cooperation as either impossible or treasonous. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything Catherine had learned about intercultural cooperation and force her to choose between the safety of conforming to white expectations and the risks of defending partnerships that transcended traditional boundaries. Her rescue of Running Wolf from the Quicksand had set in motion events that were about to reach their first crucial test, with consequences that would ripple far beyond this remote mountain valley. Captain Marcus Reynolds rode into the Shoshone camp with the bearing of a man who viewed every Native American settlement as a potential battlefield, requiring immediate subjugation. His blue cavalry uniform was immaculate despite the dusty mountain trails, and his hand rested casually on the butt of his service revolver in a gesture that spoke more of threat than caution. Behind him rode 20 soldiers whose expressions mirrored their commander's assumption that they were entering hostile territory where violence was not only possible, but probable. Catherine emerged from her assigned lodge to witness the confrontation with a mixture of dread and determination. She had anticipated this moment since Running Wolf first warned her about military patrols in the area, but the reality of facing Captain Reynolds proved more intimidating than her imagination had suggested. The officer's reputation for harsh treatment of Indians and anyone who associated with them preceded him throughout the territory, making him exactly the wrong person to encounter during delicate negotiations between communities. Running Wolf appeared at Catherine's side with the fluid grace that marked all his movements, his expression carefully controlled to reveal nothing of his thoughts to the approaching soldiers. The chief understood that any display of emotion could be interpreted as either weakness or aggression by men trained to see threats in every Native American gesture. His calm dignity in the face of obvious provocation demonstrated the kind of leadership that had earned him respect among both his own people and the few whites who had dealt with him honestly. Reynolds dismounted with theatrical precision and strode toward the center of the camp, where the tribal council was hastily assembling to deal with this unexpected military intervention. His voice carried across the valley as he announced his authority to search for missing persons and investigate reports of white captives being held against their will by hostile Indians. The accusation hung in the morning air like smoke from a signal fire, carrying implications that could justify almost any action the captain chose to take. Grey Eagle stepped forward to respond to the military challenge with the dignity that his 8 decades of leadership had taught him to maintain under pressure. His English was formal but clear as he welcomed the soldiers to the Shoshone camp, while making clear that their accusations were both unfounded and insulting to people who had always honored their agreements with white authorities. The elders' response demonstrated sophisticated understanding of legal protocols while asserting tribal sovereignty over their traditional territories. Catherine realized that she had become the focal point of a confrontation that extended far beyond her individual circumstances. Reynolds clearly suspected that her presence among the Shoshone represented either kidnapping or treason, accusations that could justify military action against the entire camp. Her response to his questions would determine whether the situation escalated into violence or could be resolved through dialogue and mutual understanding. The captain's initial interrogation focused on establishing the timeline of Catherine's arrival and the circumstances that had brought her to the Shoshone camp. His questions carried obvious assumptions about Native American duplicity and white female helplessness that revealed the depth of his prejudices about intercultural relationships. Catherine's straightforward answers about rescuing Running Wolf from Quicksand seemed to surprise Reynolds with their lack of dramatic victimization or tales of Indian savagery. Reynolds' skepticism about Catherine's voluntary presence among the Shoshone reflected broader military assumptions about the impossibility of peaceful cooperation between whites and Indians. His repeated questions about coercion and threats revealed his inability to conceive that a white woman might choose to associate with Native Americans for reasons other than force or mental incapacity. The captain's worldview simply could not accommodate the possibility that Catherine had found value in Shoshone society or had developed genuine respect for their culture and customs. The interrogation took a more dangerous turn when Reynolds began questioning Catherine about her observations of Shoshone military capabilities and strategic resources. His interest in tribal numbers, weapons, and defensive positions revealed that he viewed her potential intelligence value as more significant than any humanitarian concerns about her welfare. Catherine understood that her answers could be used to justify future military actions against Running Wolf's people, making every word a potential weapon against those who had shown her hospitality and trust. Catherine's refusal to provide military intelligence about the Shoshone camp sparked the first direct confrontation between her and Captain Reynolds. The officer's assumption that loyalty to white society automatically trumped any obligations to Indian hosts revealed the fundamental flaw in his understanding of the complex relationships that could develop across cultural boundaries. His threat to arrest her for obstruction of military operations demonstrated the lengths to which he was prepared to go to maintain white supremacy over Indian autonomy. Running Wolf's intervention in the increasingly heated exchange between Catherine and Reynolds required careful calibration to avoid escalating the confrontation into violence. The chief's offer to speak privately with the captain represented an attempt to resolve the situation through diplomatic channels while protecting both Catherine and his own people from the consequences of military displeasure. His willingness to engage directly with Reynolds, despite the obvious risks, demonstrated the kind of courage that had made him an effective leader in both peace and war. The private conversation between Running Wolf and Captain Reynolds took place near Catherine's wagon, where both men could observe the trade goods that testified to her legitimate business activities in the region. The chief's explanation of Catherine's rescue mission and subsequent cooperation seemed to make little impression on the officer, whose commitment to viewing all Indians as potential enemies prevented him from accepting evidence that contradicted his preconceptions about Native American character and motivations. Reynolds's dismissal of Running Wolf's account as elaborate deception designed to cover hostile activities reflected the kind of paranoid thinking that had characterized military-Indian relations throughout the frontier regions. The captain's insistence that peaceful appearances often masked aggressive intentions revealed his inability to distinguish between legitimate concerns about security and irrational prejudice against anyone who challenged conventional assumptions about racial hierarchies and cultural superiority. The confrontation reached a critical point when Reynolds announced his intention to escort Catherine back to the nearest military post for detailed debriefing about her experiences among the Shoshone. The captain's characterization of this action as protective custody rather than arrest fooled no one present, as everyone understood that Catherine's cooperation with his investigation would be neither voluntary nor necessarily temporary. Her knowledge of Shoshone society and resources made her valuable to military authorities who were always seeking intelligence about Indian communities. Catherine's refusal to accompany Reynolds voluntarily transformed the situation from diplomatic negotiation to direct confrontation between competing claims of authority and jurisdiction. The captain's assertion that white citizens remained subject to military protection regardless of their personal preferences clashed with Catherine's insistence on her right to make independent decisions about her associations and business relationships. The dispute embodied broader conflicts about individual autonomy versus collective security that were reshaping frontier society. The standoff between Catherine and Reynolds attracted the attention of the entire Shoshone community, whose members understood that the outcome would determine whether their experiment in intercultural cooperation could survive military intervention. Young warriors moved closer to the confrontation with obvious readiness to defend their guests, while tribal elders counseled restraint to prevent the kind of violence that would justify massive military retaliation against their people. Swift Horse's emergence from the crowd of observers added a new dimension to the confrontation, as the war chief positioned himself within striking distance of Captain Reynolds while maintaining the appearance of casual interest in the proceedings. His presence served notice that military threats against Catherine or any member of the Shoshone community would not go unchallenged, despite the obvious disparity in numbers and firepower between the cavalry patrol and the tribal warriors. Tension escalated further when one of Reynolds' sergeants reported the discovery of silver ore samples among Catherine's trade goods, evidence that seemed to confirm military suspicions about her involvement in illegal mining activities on Indian lands. The captain's assumption that Catherine was participating in unauthorized mineral extraction reflected broader white attitudes about Native American property rights and the legitimacy of tribal claims to valuable resources within their traditional territories. Catherine's explanation that the silver samples were gifts from Shoshone hosts rather than products of illegal mining operations fell on deaf ears as Reynolds seized upon this evidence to justify more aggressive investigation of both her activities and the tribe's mineral resources. The captain's interest in the location of silver deposits revealed his understanding that valuable minerals could provide justification for military occupation of Shoshone territories, regardless of existing treaty obligations or tribal sovereignty. Claims. Running Wolf's admission that his people possessed knowledge of significant silver deposits in the surrounding mountains created the kind of complication that Catherine had feared from the beginning of their partnership. The chief's honesty about tribal mineral wealth was intended to demonstrate transparency and good faith, but Reynolds interpreted it as confirmation that the Shoshone were sitting on resources that rightfully belonged to white society through The doctrine of manifest destiny and superior civilization. The captain's demand for detailed information about silver mine locations represented exactly the kind of exploitation that had destroyed peaceful relationships between whites and Indians. Throughout the frontier regions, Reynolds's assumption that military authority gave him the right to extract economic intelligence from Native American communities reflected the broader pattern of broken treaties and betrayed trusts that had characterized government relations with tribal peoples since the earliest days of westward expansion. Catherine found herself caught between competing loyalties as Reynolds threatened to arrest her for conspiracy to defraud the United States government of mineral resources unless she provided full cooperation with his investigation. The captain's characterization of her partnership with Running Wolf as criminal activity revealed his inability to conceive of legitimate business relationships that respected tribal sovereignty while creating mutual benefits for both white and Indian participants. The confrontation took a dangerous turn when Grey Eagle intervened to assert tribal authority over mineral resources within Shoshone territory, challenging Reynolds' assumption that military force could override traditional property rights whenever valuable resources were discovered. The elders' invocation of treaty obligations and federal recognition of tribal sovereignty created legal complications that the captain was neither prepared for nor interested in respecting. Reynolds' dismissal of tribal property rights as obstacles to legitimate development reflected broader military attitudes about the temporary nature of Indian treaties and the inevitability of white ownership over all valuable Western resources. His threat to call for reinforcements to secure the silver mine locations demonstrated the kind of escalation that could transform a diplomatic misunderstanding into a military campaign with devastating consequences for the Shoshone people. The crisis deepened when Bright Star stepped forward to challenge Captain Reynolds' authority to make demands of Shoshone women regarding their traditional gathering activities in areas that might contain silver deposits. Her assertion of gender-specific rights within tribal law created additional legal complications that the captain was unprepared to address through conventional military procedures. The involvement of Shoshone women in the confrontation reflected the complex social dynamics that made simple military solutions impossible in intercultural conflicts. Catherine's decision to assert her own authority as an independent businesswoman with legal rights to conduct trade activities throughout the territory created another challenge to Reynolds' assumption that military authority superseded civilian jurisdiction in Indian affairs. Her demand for access to territorial legal counsel and formal charges, if she was to be detained, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of legal protections that the captain preferred to ignore when they conflicted with military expedients. The standoff continued throughout the afternoon as neither side proved willing to back down from positions that had become matters of principle rather than practical negotiation. Reynolds' insistence on military supremacy clashed with Shoshone assertions of tribal sovereignty, while Catherine's demand for legal due process conflicted with the captain's assumption that frontier conditions justified suspension of normal constitutional protections for whites who associated with Indians. The situation reached a breaking point when Running Wolf announced his intention to travel personally to the territorial capital to file formal complaints about military harassment of peaceful trading activities and violation of treaty obligations. Regarding tribal mineral rights, the chief's threat to seek legal remedies through civilian courts represented exactly the kind of challenge to military authority that Reynolds was determined to prevent, regardless of the legal merits of Shoshone claims. Catherine realized that the confrontation had evolved beyond personal disagreements into a test case for the broader question of whether intercultural cooperation could survive systematic opposition from military and civilian authorities committed to maintaining white supremacy over Indian autonomy. Her choices in the coming hours would determine not only her own fate, but the future possibilities for the kind of partnership she and Running Wolf had envisioned. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Shoshone camp as the confrontation continued without resolution, creating an atmosphere of impending crisis that threatened to explode into violence at any moment. Catherine understood that she stood at the center of forces that could reshape frontier relations for generations, with her next decision carrying consequences far beyond anything she had imagined when she first threw her rope toward a man struggling. In Quicksand, Reynolds' final ultimatum demanded Catherine's immediate departure from Shoshone territory under military escort, with the alternative being formal arrest on charges of conspiracy and treason. The captain's threat represented the kind of abuse of authority that had destroyed countless attempts at peaceful cooperation between whites and Indians, forcing Catherine to choose between personal safety and the principles that had guided her. Rescue of Running Wolf. The moment of decision had arrived, testing everything Catherine had learned about courage, loyalty, and the price of standing up for justice when powerful interests demanded conformity to unjust systems. Her response would determine whether the Silver Mountains Running Wolf had promised would remain a dream or become the foundation for a new model of intercultural partnership that could survive military opposition and bureaucratic hostility. Catherine McKenna stood in the center of the Shoshone camp, with Captain Reynolds' ultimatum hanging in the mountain air like thunder before a storm. The weight of dozens of eyes pressed upon her, as both white soldiers and Native Americans waited to see whether she would choose the safety of compliance or the risk of defying military authority in defense of principles that transcended racial boundaries. Her decision would echo through generations, determining whether the bridge she and Running Wolf had begun building could survive its first real test. The silence stretched until Catherine found her voice, clear and steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to risk. "Captain Reynolds," she said, meeting his cold stare directly, "I came to this camp as a guest after saving Chief Running Wolf's life. I will not be dragged away like a criminal for honoring the basic human obligation to help someone in need." And her words carried across the valley with the ring of absolute conviction, marking the moment when diplomacy gave way to a test of wills that would determine the future of intercultural cooperation in the territory. Reynolds's face flushed with anger at this direct challenge to his authority, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon before military discipline reasserted control. "Miss McKenna, you are either coming with us voluntarily or under arrest. Your choice of associates has compromised your judgment and potentially your loyalty to your own people." The captain's threat revealed the depth of his conviction that white solidarity should always trump individual conscience when dealing with Indian affairs. Running Wolf stepped forward with the calm dignity that marked all his actions, positioning himself beside Catherine in a gesture of support that spoke louder than any verbal declaration. "Captain Reynolds," the chief said in his careful English, "this woman saved my life when I was dying in Quicksand. Among my people, such a debt creates sacred obligations that cannot be broken for political convenience. Any harm to her dishonors the courage she showed and violates laws older than your government." The Shoshone leader's invocation of sacred debt introduced spiritual dimensions to the confrontation that Reynolds was neither prepared for nor capable of understanding. His military training had provided no framework for dealing with Native American concepts of honor and obligation that transcended conventional political relationships. The captain's frustration at facing arguments that fell outside his narrow worldview was evident in his increasingly aggressive posture and shortened responses. Gray Eagle emerged from the cluster of tribal elders with the slow but purposeful movement of someone whose authority derived from decades of wise leadership rather than military rank. When the elderly chief spoke, his words carried the weight of traditional law and cultural precedent that had governed Shoshone society for countless generations. "Young soldier," he said with formal courtesy that barely concealed steel underneath, "you stand on Shoshone land, speaking of taking away someone who has earned our protection through courage and kindness. This is not how honorable men behave." The elder's characterization of Reynolds as young soldier, despite the captain's obvious seniority in white society, represented a subtle but devastating challenge to military authority based on cultural values that recognized wisdom and moral character over institutional rank. Grey Eagle's words reminded everyone present that authority derived from different sources in different societies, and that military power alone could not justify actions that violated fundamental principles of justice and reciprocity. Catherine felt the moment crystallizing around her as she realized that her individual choice would determine whether the fragile cooperation between communities could survive systematic opposition from those committed to maintaining racial hierarchies through force. "Captain," she said with growing confidence, "I appreciate your concern for my welfare, but I am a free citizen of this territory with the right to make my own decisions about my associations and business partnerships. Unless you have specific charges against me, I choose to remain here as a guest of the Shoshone people." Reynolds' response revealed the extent to which military authority had been corrupted by racial prejudice and institutional arrogance. "Miss McKenna, your judgment has clearly been compromised by prolonged exposure to savage influences. For your own protection and the security of this territory, I am placing you under protective custody pending evaluation by competent medical authorities." The captain's characterization of her decision as evidence of mental incapacity demonstrated his inability to conceive that rational white people might find value in Native American society. The insult implicit in Reynolds' declaration sparked immediate reaction from the assembled Shoshone, whose understanding of English was sufficient to grasp the offensive nature of his assumptions about their influence on Catherine's mental state. Swift Horse and several younger warriors moved closer to the confrontation with obvious readiness to defend their guest's honor against military slanders, while tribal elders counseled restraint to prevent the kind of violence that would justify massive retaliation against their people. Catherine's anger at Reynolds' patronizing dismissal of her autonomy burned away the last vestiges of her willingness to compromise with military authority. "Captain Reynolds," she said with ice in her voice, "my judgment is perfectly sound. I choose to associate with people who honor courage and repay kindness with loyalty rather than with those who substitute prejudice for wisdom and force for justice. If you want to arrest me, you'll need specific charges and legal warrants, not simply disapproval of my associates." The confrontation might have escalated into immediate violence, if not for the intervention of an unexpected voice that cut through the tension with the authority of federal law. "Captain Reynolds, stand down your weapon and step away from Miss McKenna immediately." The command came from a man emerging from the tree line on horseback, wearing the uniform of a territorial marshal whose jurisdiction superseded military authority in civilian matters. Marshal James Harrison dismounted with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to resolving conflicts between competing jurisdictions and conflicting interpretations of territorial law. His arrival represented exactly the kind of federal intervention that could either validate Catherine's position or confirm Reynolds' authority, depending on his assessment of the legal and political dimensions of the confrontation. Catherine felt hope stirring as she recognized that civilian law enforcement might provide the protection that military authority was determined to deny. The marshal's first actions established his priorities as he moved to position himself between the opposing forces while addressing both military and tribal representatives with equal courtesy. I am Marshal Harrison, investigating reports of conflicts between military personnel and civilian traders in this region. Before anyone takes any irreversible actions, I need to understand exactly what has transpired here and what legal issues are at stake. Reynolds' protest that military security considerations superseded civilian jurisdiction fell on deaf ears as Marshal Harrison asserted federal authority over territorial disputes involving competing claims of legal precedence. The captain's frustration at seeing his authority challenged by someone whose understanding of constitutional law exceeded his own revealed the institutional weaknesses that had allowed military commanders to abuse their power in dealing with Native American communities throughout the frontier regions. Catherine seized the opportunity presented by Harrison's intervention to present her case with the clarity and documentation that her years as a trader had taught her to maintain in all business dealings. She produced the written records of her trading activities, her rescue of Running Wolf, and the preliminary agreements they had discussed regarding mineral rights and intercultural cooperation. The marshal's examination of these documents revealed their legitimate business nature and Catherine's legal right to engage in such activities. Running Wolf's presentation of his credentials as a recognized tribal leader with authority to negotiate agreements on behalf of his people added another layer of legal complexity that Reynolds had either ignored or failed to understand. The chief's diplomatic status under federal treaty obligations created protections that military commanders could not simply override when civilian Indian cooperation conflicted with their preference for maintaining racial tensions and territorial conflicts. Marshal Harrison's questions revealed sophisticated understanding of the legal frameworks governing territorial development, tribal sovereignty, and individual rights that exposed the shallow foundation of Reynolds' aggressive interventions. The marshal's expertise in constitutional law and federal precedent regarding Indian affairs provided exactly the kind of authoritative interpretation that could resolve the confrontation without violence, while establishing clear boundaries for future military actions in similar situations. The turning point came when Harrison announced his preliminary finding that Catherine's activities fell clearly within her legal rights as a territorial citizen engaged in legitimate commerce with recognized tribal authorities. The marshal's determination that no laws had been violated and no federal interests threatened removed the legal foundation for Reynolds' threatened arrest while establishing precedent for future intercultural business relationships that respected both individual autonomy and tribal sovereignty. Reynolds' final attempt to maintain military authority through claims about security threats and potential Indian uprisings crumbled under Harrison's detailed questioning about specific evidence and documented incidents. The captain's inability to provide concrete justification for his actions beyond general prejudices and institutional assumptions exposed the weakness of arguments based on racial stereotypes rather than observable facts and legal precedents. The marshal's formal determination that military intervention was unwarranted and potentially illegal sent shockwaves through both the cavalry patrol and the Shoshone community, establishing a new framework for resolving conflicts between white and Indian interests through legal rather than military means. Harrison's assertion of civilian authority over territorial affairs represented a fundamental shift away from the military domination that had characterized frontier policy for decades. Catherine felt overwhelming relief as the immediate threat of arrest dissolved under the weight of federal legal authority, but she also understood that her real test was just beginning. Marshal Harrison's protection had preserved her right to make independent choices, but the success of her partnership with Running Wolf would depend on her ability to navigate the complex challenges of building sustainable cooperation between Communities that had been conditioned to view each other with suspicion and hostility. The resolution of the military crisis opened space for the substantive discussions about mineral rights and intercultural cooperation that Catherine and Running Wolf had been developing before Reynolds's intervention. Grey Eagle's invitation for Marshal Harrison to witness the Tribal Council's deliberations about silver mining partnerships represented unprecedented openness to federal oversight of traditionally internal tribal decisions, reflecting the Shoshone understanding that legal precedent was being established. Harrison's acceptance of the role as federal observer in the negotiations between Catherine and the Shoshone leadership provided exactly the kind of legitimacy that could protect their partnership from future challenges by military or civilian authorities who opposed intercultural cooperation. The Marshal's presence ensured that any agreements reached would carry federal recognition and legal protection against the kind of arbitrary interference that had destroyed so many previous attempts at peaceful coexistence. The formal negotiations that followed over the next 3 days established a new model for resource development that respected tribal sovereignty while creating economic opportunities for both white and Indian participants. Catherine's proposal for joint mining ventures with shared ownership and management responsibilities addressed Shoshone concerns about environmental protection while providing the technical expertise and market access that would make large-scale silver extraction profitable for both communities. Running Wolf's detailed presentation of the silver deposits hidden throughout the Ruby Mountains revealed mineral wealth that exceeded even Catherine's optimistic estimates. The chief's willingness to share such valuable information reflected the depth of trust that had developed between them, while also demonstrating his sophisticated understanding of how controlled resource development could strengthen rather than undermine tribal autonomy and cultural preservation. The partnership agreement that emerged from these negotiations represented a revolutionary approach to intercultural cooperation that balanced individual initiative with collective responsibility, white technological capabilities with native American environmental wisdom, and immediate economic benefits with long-term sustainability. Marshal Harrison's certification of the agreement provided federal recognition that would protect it from future challenges while establishing precedent for similar partnerships throughout the territory. Catherine's transformation from frontier trader to intercultural business pioneer reflected the broader changes that were reshaping territorial society as traditional racial hierarchies gave way to more complex relationships based on mutual benefit rather than dominance and submission. Her partnership with Running Wolf demonstrated that cooperation could produce results that benefited both communities while respecting the cultural values that made each distinctive and valuable. The success of their joint mining ventures exceeded even the most optimistic projections. A Shoshone knowledge of ore locations combined with Catherine's understanding of extraction technology and market dynamics to create unprecedented profits that were shared equally between white and Indian participants. The Silver Mountains that Running Wolf had promised proved to contain enough wealth to establish Catherine as one of the territory's most successful entrepreneurs while providing the Shoshone with economic independence that protected them from the poverty and dependency that had destroyed so many other tribal communities. The model they established spread throughout the region as other tribal leaders and white entrepreneurs recognized the advantages of cooperation over conflict in developing the West's natural resources. Catherine's reputation as someone who honored agreements and respected cultural differences attracted partnerships that extended far beyond mining into agriculture, transportation, and manufacturing ventures that created prosperity for diverse communities throughout the territory. Years later, as Catherine stood on the mountain ridge overlooking the sprawling silver mining complex that had grown from her partnership with Running Wolf, She reflected on the chain of events that had begun with a simple act of human decency beside a quicksand bog. The rescue of a dying chief had indeed led to Silver Mountains, but more importantly, it had proven that courage and compassion could overcome the prejudices and fears that had kept communities apart for generations. Running Wolf, now recognized as one of the territory's most influential leaders, joined her on the ridge to survey the thriving intercultural community that had grown around their mining operations. Workers from dozens of different backgrounds labored together in the silver mines and processing facilities, while their families lived in integrated neighborhoods where children grew up speaking multiple languages and learning from diverse cultural traditions. The transformation of the Ruby Mountains from isolated wilderness to prosperous intercultural community represented everything Catherine and Running Wolf had hoped to achieve when they first began discussing partnership during their journey from the Quicksand bog to the Shoshone camp. Their success had created ripple effects that extended throughout the American West, inspiring similar experiments in cooperation that gradually replaced the cycle of conflict and retaliation that had characterized frontier relations for decades. Catherine's personal wealth from the silver mines had made her one of the territory's most influential citizens, but her greater satisfaction came from the knowledge that her rescue of Running Wolf had created something far more valuable than individual prosperity. The intercultural community they had built together demonstrated that America's future lay not in the domination of one group over others, but in the creative partnerships that could emerge when people chose cooperation over conflict and mutual respect over mutual destruction. The Silver Mountains had indeed fulfilled Running Wolf's promise, but the true treasure Catherine discovered was the understanding that individual acts of courage could reshape entire societies when they were grounded in recognition of our shared humanity. Her decision to throw a rope toward a dying man had become the foundation for a new model of American community that honored diversity while creating unity, respected differences while building bridges, and proved that the greatest wealth came not from what could be extracted from the earth, but from what could be built through the patient work of turning enemies into allies and strangers into family. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.